In the forgotten folds of the Appalachian backcountry, where the mountains rise like ancient ribs and the valleys sink into permanent shadow, there existed a sect whose name was spoken only by those who feared the sound of their own voice. A place where lineage mattered more than law, where daughters were not merely daughters but sacred vessels, and where bloodlines curled back upon themselves in ways that strained against nature. This was the Children of Eden, a congregation so secretive, so sealed off from the outside world, that its presence was almost mythical until the day the truth finally tore through the fog. For decades, the sect had existed beyond the reach of roads, maps, and reason. Wrapped in the mist-soaked hollows of eastern Tennessee, they constructed a world entirely their own, one ruled not by modern faith or civil order but by a doctrine that twisted scripture into something monstrous. Their belief system demanded purity at any cost, purity measured not in deeds or devotion but in the closeness of blood. And so generation after generation obeyed, producing children whose bodies bore the silent consequences of their forefathers' creed. Authorities had no knowledge of the community until 1972, when a call came that would fracture the illusion of isolation forever. The settlement, situated in a valley so deep the sun reached it only for a few hours each day, held an aura of untouched stillness. A single dirt path, more animal trail than road, snaked through thickets of pine and oak before vanishing into dense forest, leaving the outside world behind. Travelers never passed that way. Locals avoided it. Even hunters joked the mountains wanted that place for themselves. From a distance, the compound appeared deceptively harmless, 12 small, hand-built cabins arranged in a careful circle, each facing inward toward a squat meeting hall made of old timber. Smoke often curled from the chimneys in winter, drifting lazily into the low-lying clouds. To an unfamiliar eye, it could have been mistaken for a humble homestead or a tight-knit rural community. But behind those unassuming walls, behind the shutters permanently drawn and the gates always locked, something unspeakable was unfolding. The Children of Eden began in 1921 under the leadership of Isaiah Shepherd, a former Methodist preacher whose charisma once filled pews. In his early years he had been a man of striking passion, fiery sermons, intricate biblical knowledge, and the ability to move a congregation from tears to fervor. Yet something inside him shifted after a string of tragedies struck his family. His writings from that time reveal a mind unraveling, searching for patterns in sorrow, grasping for meaning where none existed. He became obsessed with the concept of corrupted blood, convinced that human suffering stemmed from centuries of impurity in the lineage of mankind. What began as errant theological musings hardened into a worldview that rejected the outside world entirely. According to Isaiah, humanity had strayed far from the perfection of Eden, tainted by unions with lesser lines. If purity could be restored, he claimed, mankind's divine nature would bloom again. His manifesto, discovered decades later in the dust of the meeting hall, contained the chilling passage. As the patriarchs in ancient days took their kin as wives, so too must we revive Eden's purity. The sacred blood must remain unbroken, unsullied, preserved as the Lord intended. By the late 1920s, Isaiah had gathered a small core of followers, mostly extended relatives, cousins by blood or marriage, who believed his revelations were genuine. Together they purchased over 200 acres of remote Tennessee woodland and began constructing their isolated world. For a time, the community lived in relative quiet. Outsiders occasionally saw them in neighboring towns buying supplies or selling hand-forged tools. But after 1932, following the death of Isaiah's wife, their doors seemed to close permanently. A veil descended over the compound. No outsiders visited. No children attended local schools. No one left except under the most controlled circumstances. The shift from isolation to something far darker began subtly, almost imperceptibly. After his wife's death, Isaiah took her younger sister as his new bride, a choice unusual but not unheard of in rural communities. But soon after, he claimed one of his own nieces as a spiritual consort, declaring her blood unspeakably pure. That union marked the beginning of a lineage folded onto itself, generation after generation, until escape seemed not only impossible but inconceivable. 3 generations lived and died according to Isaiah's doctrine before anyone from the outside world truly understood what was happening. Isaiah died in 1965, leaving his eldest son Abraham to carry the mantle. Abraham lacked his father's charisma but possessed something far more dangerous: unshakable devotion to the purity laws. He escalated the practices. His first wife was his cousin. His later wives included 3 of his nieces, each consecrated through rituals that treated their bodies as breeding ground for what he called the restored essence. And it was one of these girls, a 16-year-old named Eliza, who finally fractured the silence their world had depended on. Late one rainy night, wearing only a thin dress and carrying injuries that told a story before she ever spoke, Eliza fled through the forest. She ran until her legs gave out, then crawled the last miles until she reached a lone gas station glowing faintly on the roadside like a beacon in the darkness. Soaked, shivering, half delirious, she staggered inside and pleaded for help. When officers arrived, her voice was barely audible. "They're giving me to my uncle," she said, trembling. "They say I'm pure enough now, and there are others. So many others." Investigators followed her directions deep into the mountains and stepped into a nightmare disguised as a settlement. Inside the meeting hall, they found walls plastered with sprawling genealogical charts, lines looping endlessly, the same surnames repeating across every generation. Margins contained elaborate calculations, percentages, symbols, and coded annotations detailing which pairings would maximize divine purity. It was a theological system of control and a breeding program masquerading as salvation. Children growing up inside the community never learned otherwise. They believed the world outside was poisoned, that outsiders were corrupted beings, and that their only purpose was to keep the sacred lineage alive. Girls were told their bodies were holy vessels. Boys were raised to continue the bloodline. And questioning these commandments was unthinkable. To them, this was not horror, it was home. The deeper investigators pushed into the hollow, the more they realized that the family's secrecy wasn't simply stubborn mountain pride, it was engineered. Generations had perfected the art of disappearing from the outside world. Paths intentionally overgrown. Old road signs removed. And every cabin window, no matter how dilapidated, covered with the same heavy black curtains stitched from coarse wool. Curtains meant not to block sunlight, but to keep wandering eyes out. Rumors told of an earlier era when strangers occasionally wandered into that valley, lost hunters, traveling merchants, even a census man. None of them left with the same stories. Some swore they saw unnaturally silent children standing barefoot in tree lines, blinking too slowly, as if unsure how long normal people kept their eyes open. Others described a lingering odor, an impossible blend of mildew, metal, and something sour, that clung to their clothes for days afterward. Local lawmen heard these tales and shrugged them off for decades. Mountain gossip. Backwards imagination. Until the first real report surfaced, an anonymous letter mailed from a nearby mining town, written in shaky handwriting that suggested fear or age or both. It claimed that within that forgotten valley lived a closed blood, a lineage that refused to mix with outsiders, enforcing marriages and births within the same tangled family branches. The writer insisted that the children there were born with the marks of the mountain curse, though what those marks were, they never clarified. For years, that letter sat in a dusty file cabinet, ignored. Only later would investigators admit that neglecting it had allowed something horrifying to grow even deeper roots. As winter pressed in, the hollow became even more isolating. Snow smothered the dirt roads, turning the valley into a white tomb. That was when the family's rituals grew most fervent. It was said that winter births were the favored ones, the ones the elders believed were chosen. Midwives were not professionals or even experienced women, they were chosen from within the family, often those whose eyesight had faded or whose mind had grown clouded from age or poor health. They delivered every child in the same room, a narrow loft above the oldest cabin, lit only by oil lamps that flickered as if disturbed by a constant unseen breath. Those who heard the stories whispered another unsettling detail: every birth began with a chant. A chant that wasn't English. Not even close. The language belonged to the family alone, an inherited tongue developed from centuries of isolation, strange in rhythm, harsh in sound, like gravel poured through a wooden funnel. No outsider had ever recorded it. And anyone who had heard even fragments spoke of a cadence that made their skin rise with cold prickles. The investigators who later interviewed surviving relatives noticed how the old ones avoided English when recalling their rituals. Their eyes drifted, unfocused, as though translating from a deeper, older place in their mind. A place untouched by the modern world. One woman, frail, withdrawn, her fingers trembling as if always cold, recounted how the family taught children that the outside world was poison. That outsiders carried sickness in their blood and sin in their bones. That the valley was a sanctuary built by their ancestors long before maps were drawn. Leaving it meant abandoning the protection of the bloodline. Mixing with outsiders meant tainting something sacred. This belief wasn't written anywhere. It was spoken at every meal, every gathering, every winter birth. Whispered like a prayer. Repeated until it carved itself into the family's identity as deeply as their last name. Generations grew up never questioning it. Generations accepted the rule that children born within the same blood were purified, while those with outside lineage would be broken. And with each generation, the truth grew darker, the bloodline was collapsing, slowly, quietly, under the weight of its own isolation. Some children were born with limbs that didn't form correctly. Others spoke in slurred echoes, their tongues too large or too small. A few never learned to speak at all. And every one of these children was hidden away, raised in back rooms, fed separately, never allowed to be seen by wandering eyes. But the elders saw them not as a tragedy, rather, as proof that the bloodline remained pure. Proof that their ancestors' command still echoed through the marrow of the living. The outside world did not know this yet. But soon, they would. The turning point for outsiders came in the late autumn of 1984, when the valley's silence was broken by the disappearance of a forest surveyor named Thomas Weller. His job was routine: map out portions of the old timber tract and verify boundary lines. The kind of work that required long stretches alone in the woods, a clipboard, and a compass. Weller was meticulous, experienced, and familiar with Appalachian terrain. Which is why, when he failed to return to his truck by sundown, authorities initially assumed a simple miscalculation. But when they found his vehicle untouched, keys still in the ignition, thermos still warm, they understood that something deeper had gone wrong. The first search team pushed into the timberland the next morning. Winds carried a strange stillness through the trees, the kind that makes every snapped twig feel like it's signaling a warning. They found Weller's trail easily, crisp footprints in the brittle leaves, clean cuts through brush from his machete. For nearly half a mile, the path was perfectly coherent. Then, without any reason, the trail veered sharply toward the valley that locals warned travelers never to enter. His last known footprint stopped just 50 yards from the tree line where the family's territory unofficially began. No blood. No signs of struggle. No indication he had turned back. It was as if he walked willingly into a place most men wouldn't approach even with a loaded weapon. Authorities canvassed the families nearby, but every door they knocked on remained closed longer than necessary. Eyes peeked through curtains before any lock clicked open. Replies were short, rehearsed. No one had seen him. No one heard anything unusual. No one knew why he'd walked that far north. But one detail unsettled the officers more than the silence: every cabin smelled faintly of smoke and boiled rags, a chemical tang that made their throats itch. It wasn't the scent of cooking. It was the scent of cleansing, like someone attempting to erase a presence that had passed through. For weeks, Weller's disappearance haunted the county. Search dogs refused to cross the hollow's boundary. Drones weren't yet available. Without them, the dense canopy overhead might as well have been a steel door. Eventually, efforts faded. Winter arrived. Snow erased whatever clues remained. But among the old-timers, an explanation spread quietly: Weller had seen something he shouldn't have, something the family did not allow outsiders to witness. Journalists probed the story years later and found a chilling pattern: Weller wasn't the first. Over the decades, at least 3 other men had vanished along the same timber tract, 2 hunters and a traveling mechanic. Their disappearances never reached the newspapers because the county had a long tradition of leaving missing people cases in the hands of the mountain. An unspoken rule. What the mountain takes, the mountain keeps. The investigators studying the sect decades later believed those men had stumbled upon the family's winter rituals, a time when the women of the bloodline were confined indoors, the men patrolled the perimeter, and no outsider was permitted to witness their ceremonies. Rituals that centered around maintaining seasonal births and reinforcing family hierarchy. Rituals where men decided which cousins or siblings would be paired that year. Survivors later described the selection nights in disturbing detail. The elders sat around a rough-hewn table, lit by kerosene lamps that cast long, trembling shadows. Names were drawn not from a hat, but from a wooden box carved by the founding patriarch nearly a century earlier. Every name belonged to someone genetically connected, often by the thinnest thread. Once chosen, the pairing was sealed before sunrise. No refusal. No negotiation. The later generation spoke of the dread leading up to these nights, the tightening in the gut, the silent meals, the way mothers clutched their daughters' hands but never spoke out loud. Because speaking out loud meant defying the blood. And defying the blood meant punishment. Some women were sent to the old smokehouse. Others were locked in the birthing loft with no food. A few simply disappeared. The men of the family were not immune either. Those who questioned the elders were declared tainted by outside influence and ostracized. Their names were removed from the pairing box, not as punishment but as erasure. Once your name left the box, you were no longer considered part of the lineage, you were treated like a stranger. And in that valley, strangers did not last long. By the mid-1990s, new stories trickled out, not from adults, but from children who managed to escape during the rare moments the elders' vigilance faltered. One boy, no older than 9, was found near a dirt road miles from the valley. Frostbitten. Barefoot. Barely lucid. He muttered fragments of sentences that investigators pieced together like a ransom note. Too many cousins, too many babies, the wolves watching, the old ones choosing. His drawings were even worse. Stick figures with double joints. Women crying in small loft rooms. Tall shapes looming behind them with arms far too long. When asked about the missing surveyor, the boy only said, "He walked where the ground hums." Investigators would later determine that the humming ground referred to the old burial mound at the center of the valley, an ancestral site where the founding members were entombed. A place no child was supposed to go. A place where outsiders who wandered too close were never seen again. The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized the valley was not just isolated, it was fortified by ritual, habit, and something darker than fear. Something inherited. Something protected. And the truth behind that protection was about to surface. By the early 2000s, the Hollow had taken on an almost mythic status among the few locals who still dared whisper about it. People didn't mention the family by name anymore, only by gestures, vague descriptions, and careful phrasing. A nod in a certain direction. A glance over the shoulder before speaking. No one wanted their curiosity mistaken for intrusion. Curiosity was how men vanished. Yet despite the fear, the outside world was creeping closer. State lines were shifting. Property disputes in neighboring counties forced survey maps to be re-examined. And in 2003, a mining company proposed a new exploratory route through the northern ridges, not realizing that its plans placed heavy machinery dangerously close to the valley that time had tried to erase. That proposal triggered the first official investigation in decades. 2 anthropologists and a cultural field researcher were assigned to conduct a preliminary environmental and cultural assessment. They arrived with modest expectations: photograph abandoned homesteads, collect soil samples, and interview a few willing locals. Nothing more. But the moment they stepped out of their vehicle, they sensed something was wrong. The air clung with a heaviness uncommon for early spring. Birds that typically littered the canopy at that time of year were absent. No calls. No rustlings. Not even the scrape of squirrels against bark. It was as if the valley itself held its breath. On their third day, the team located the old trail believed to be connected to Weller's disappearance nearly 20 years earlier. The path was narrower now, reclaimed by vines and knee-high brush, but still traceable. One of the anthropologists, Dr. Harris, documented something peculiar along its route. Every 50 feet or so, someone had tied strips of faded cloth to the branches. Not colorful, like marking flags. These were stained, torn, weather-beaten pieces of fabric decorated with faint, hand-stitched symbols. Triangles intersecting circles. Lines crossed in sets of 3. Shapes that didn't align with any known Cherokee, Shawnee, or settler markings. Dr. Harris took photographs. Later analysis confirmed the disturbing truth: the symbols matched those found carved into the wooden pairing box described by surviving sect members. They were territorial markers, warnings for insiders, not outsiders. They indicated safe routes for the family during ritual nights, and boundaries children must never cross. The cloth markers escalated in density until the team reached the first structure, a collapsed cabin, half swallowed by moss and rot. But beneath the ruin, something still clung to life. A faint trail of smoke rose from a rusted chimney pipe, thin but unmistakable. Someone was inside. The field researcher approached cautiously, calling out, announcing their presence. No response. Just the slow beat of wind against the cabin's warped boards. When they stepped onto the porch, the smell hit them, an acrid mix of animal tallow, burned herbs, and something metallic. They pushed the door open only a few inches before stopping. Inside the one-room cabin were dozens of small handcrafted dolls, figures made from sticks, twine, and dried bark. Each doll had a face scratched onto its head with charcoal. Some were crossed out violently. Others were arranged in circles or lines, like they were replicating rituals in miniature. But the worst part, many of them had extra limbs, split jaws, or 2 heads fused together. Horrific echoes of the abnormalities investigators had reported in hidden children decades earlier. Dr. Harris collected only one of the dolls before insisting they leave. She noted that every instinct she had, professional and human, told her the place was not abandoned. Something or someone had been there recently. And they were likely watching. That night, back at their temporary base, the team reviewed audio they had recorded on their hike. At the 23-minute mark, the microphone picked up something none of them remembered hearing at the time, an overlapping murmur of voices in the distance. Not English. Not whispering. More like chanting, carried faintly on the wind. The cadence matched the phonetic patterns found earlier in reports of the sect's birthing rituals. They had recorded the family's hidden language. The next morning, the team attempted to re-enter the valley, eager to pinpoint the source of the chanting. But when they reached the same trail, all the fabric markers had been removed. Every single one. The branches were bare, as though scrubbed clean overnight. The cabin's smoke chimney was now collapsed. The dolls, every one of them, were gone. As if the valley were resetting itself. Erasing their tracks. On the ground where the dolls had been arranged, Dr. Harris spotted something half buried in the dirt. A single footprint. Small. Child-sized. But the shape was wrong, too wide at the arch, with an extra indentation near the outer edge, almost like a second heel. The field researcher refused to proceed further. They documented what they could, packed their equipment, and left before dusk. 3 months later, their report was quietly filed away, marked insufficient evidence of culturally significant structures. The mining plans were deferred, not because of the valley, but because of unrelated funding issues. And the family remained untouched, unseen, unchallenged. But the recordings didn't vanish. Nor did the dolls' analysis. Over time, they circulated among academic circles, eventually catching the attention of a retired investigator who had once worked on missing persons cases in that same region. His curiosity, to many, his obsession, was reignited. He reached out to former deputies, aging locals, and family members who had escaped the sect decades earlier. Piece by piece, he reconstructed the truth. The valley wasn't empty. The bloodline hadn't fractured. Its traditions never weakened. It was still there, breeding, hiding, watching. And it was about to be exposed in a way it never had before. The retired investigator, Samuel R. Denton, had spent nearly 2 decades reviewing cases from Appalachia's most remote corners. Missing hunters. Lost hikers. Families that vanished without a trace. Most he attributed to the brutal terrain, the winter storms, or the unforgiving isolation of the mountains. But something about the valley's pattern had always lingered like a sliver under his skin. The clustering of disappearances. The strange descriptions from early reports. The unnamed family that locals wouldn't speak about, not even when they were dying in hospital beds. After hearing the anthropologist's findings, Denton made a decision he knew was reckless. He wasn't going to publish an article. He wasn't going to send a letter to the sheriff. He was going to walk into that valley himself. He picked early November, a time when leaves were brittle, when visibility increased, when the family's rituals were at their lowest ebb before winter births began. He carried only a small pack, a camera, and a handheld recorder. Not out of bravery, but because he knew too much equipment made noise. On his second day in the wilderness, he found the path the team had documented. The cloth markers had not returned. But tree bark along the trail bore faint knife carvings, symbols nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Circles intersected with crooked lines. Repeated threefold. Territorial markings. Warnings. He followed them deeper. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No insects humming. No birds calling. The deeper he walked, the more the silence pressed against him like a physical weight. He wrote in his notes that it felt like descending underwater, sound dampened, vision sharpened, instinct screaming. Then, around midday, he saw it. A cabin, not collapsed, not rotting, but maintained. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney. Firewood stacked neatly. Curtains drawn. A sign that someone, many someones, still lived there. Denton approached slowly, circling the structure to observe it without announcing himself. Behind the cabin, the forest floor dipped into a shallow basin, and there he found something he would later describe as the moment the entire investigation tilted into nightmare. Rows of small footprints. Dozens of them. Leading in and out of the cabin. Some normal. Some not. Some with splayed toes. Some with doubled arches. One set with an extended heel mark, identical to the malformed print the anthropologists documented months earlier. He photographed everything. Then he followed the tracks. They led him deeper into a clearing he hadn't noticed at first, camouflaged by leaning trees and branches bound with rope. In the center of that clearing stood a structure unlike the rest of the valley's cabins. A ceremonial hall. Wooden beams coated in ash. Bones, small and large, hung on strings like wind chimes. Runes carved into the ground. And in the center, a stone mound covered with moss, surrounded by beaten earth. The humming ground. The burial place of the founding bloodline. Denton pressed record on his device. At first, he heard only his own breath. But then, beneath it, faintly, like a vibration against the ribcage, came a sound. A drawn-out, rising cadence. A chant. The same rhythm recorded by the anthropologists. The language of the sect. And it was getting louder. He ducked behind the mound. From between the trees, shapes emerged. Men first, broad-shouldered, silent, carrying animal skins and lanterns. Then women, thin, pale, moving with synchronized steps like they had rehearsed the pattern since infancy. And behind them, the children. Denton later wrote that the children were the hardest to look at. Some looked perfectly normal. Some held hands with siblings who were visibly deformed, convex foreheads, widened jaws, fused fingers. Some walked on the sides of their feet. Some did not walk at all, instead carried in cloth slings by older family members. Yet there was no shame. No secrecy. The family moved with purpose. With unity. With ritual. The chanting grew louder. Faster. Voices overlapping like woven threads. The men circled the mound. The women knelt. The children stood in scattered clusters, humming along with the tune in dissonant harmony. At the front of the procession stood an elder, stooped, grey-haired, with a face creased like weathered bark. He carried a wooden box. The pairing box. Denton realized too late that he was witnessing a selection night, the ritual determining which relatives would be paired for conception before the winter births. He tried to pull back, but his coat snagged on the stone mound. A small noise, barely more than a scrape, echoed across the clearing. The ritual stopped. Every head turned toward the sound. Lanterns swung. Children froze. The chanting cut off mid-breath. Denton held himself rigid, scarcely daring to breathe. But the elder raised a lantern toward the mound, its glow stretching across the clearing stones like fingers reaching for a throat. A voice, soft, slow, foreign, echoed from behind Denton. "You walked where the blood sees." He spun. A child stood there. A girl no older than 8. Barefoot. Pale as snow. One eye slightly lower than the other. She looked at him without fear, without curiosity, only recognition. She knew he didn't belong. She opened her mouth to scream. Denton ran. Branches tore at his arms. Roots clawed his boots. Behind him, the voices erupted in a cacophony of rage, adults shouting, children wailing, feet pounding the earth. He didn't stop. Not when he heard the first impact of bodies crashing through brush. Not when something sharp sliced across his back. Not when a deep, guttural bellow echoed from behind him, so inhuman he could not tell if it came from a man or something else entirely. He didn't stop until the trees thinned. Until the wind returned. Until the valley released him. Epilogue: what remained? Denton survived. Barely. He reached a ranger station at dawn, hysterical, bleeding, rambling about a living sect, inbred children, and ritual pairings. But when authorities returned to the valley days later, everything was gone. No cabins. No footprints. No ceremonial hall. No mound. No cloth markers. No dolls. The valley appeared untouched. Like no human had lived there in 100 years. Denton's photos came back corrupted, blurred, warped, half-black. His recordings were filled with static, except for one section where the faint hum of chanting still pulsed like a heartbeat. Officials dismissed the case. Locals refused to discuss it. And the valley's existence quietly dissolved back into rumor. But one fact remained. The bloodline was never found. Because families like that do not vanish. They relocate. They redefine territory. They reroute themselves where eyes don't wander. And somewhere in the Appalachian spine, another clearing waits. Another pairing box sits ready. Another winter birth approaches. The sect didn't die. It simply moved.